Maybe you're killing your plants, but are your plants trying to kill you? Prepare for houseplant homicide in this week's show. As I talk with Marta McDowell about her new book, Gardening is Murder. Now, I thought for Halloween week we'd go a little bit off-piste to find out how mystery writers have been inspired by plants and gardens. Whether you are a Halloween enthusiast or naysayer, it matters not. This episode is a fun diversion from normal life to take a look at the wonderful genre of the mystery novel, also known as crime fiction or murder mysteries, and how they relate to gardens, plants and planty people. And there's no better person to talk about that than Marta McDowell, whose other works include Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life and All the President's Gardens. So settle down with a small glass of sherry beside a roaring fire and enjoy our chat.
I'm Marta McDowell. I'm a writer and I teach landscape history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden.
Gardening Can Be Murder, great title for this spooky week of Halloween. Tell me about where this all began.
So I think that the light bulb turned on with a little paperback book I picked up in the, I'm going to say late 1990s. It was called Mulch, and it was by a garden journalist named Anne Ripley. I don't think Anne's with us anymore, but she was from Colorado. And her protagonist was a garden writer, not surprisingly. And it was a horticultural mystery. It takes place in Washington, D.C. It had a lot of different components. And it was then I thought, oh, wait a minute, this might be a topic I could write about. And I did write an article for a wonderful little garden journal called Hortus. David Wheeler, the editor, is very kind to me and lets me try out lots of different kind of zany ideas. And so that came out in 2002. And then this book actually grew out of that little global pandemic we had. So, I needed something to work on. And that just, it spoke to me because I could write it without access to research libraries, which were hard to get to.
Yeah, I sympathise as somebody who was trying to write the book at the same time. Yeah, it was tough. And the book gives us a lot of insight into these works which draw on plants, gardens, people who love plants, tools that are involved in gardening, and their role in dastardly goings on. Why do you think that this genre is so kind of soaked in sap, as it were?
Well, gardening is something of a mystery. Anyone who grows plants knows that you're always solving a puzzle. Why does this propagant, why is it doing well and this one isn't? Why did that plant die? Did I kill it? Was I the murderer? I was trying to piece it together. It has that nice kind of life and death contrast. We have that idea of a garden being Edenic, and yet it is a place where lots of bodies get hidden. Walk through the crime fiction section of your local bookstore, and invariably you will see a cover that has an illustration of, a shovel and, and a hole, and, they're putting a body in there. And plus lots of things in the garden can kill you.
Exactly. I mean, I'm just wondering now, as you're speaking about compost heaps, and whether there must be a novel somewhere where somebody's ended up in a compost heap, because whenever I'm turning my compost heap, I'm always thinking about death. I mean, that sounds really kind of negative, but actually it's a wonderful insight into the cycle of life and death that we are all, whether we like it or not, a part of. I don't know if there's been any novels where somebody's sort of secreted a body inside a compost heap, but yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Not only Mulch, that very first one that it was, well, I don't know. In the States, we have this strange suburban phenomenon that people rake their leaves, and many people put them in big brown paper bags. And then the town comes and picks them up for the municipal compost, or compost, as I say. And that figures into mulch. So in that novel, let's just say you find body parts, right? And there's another one called Compost Mortem, good title, which a compost area does figure in. So absolutely, people have been very creative about how they use different aspects of horticulture.
Obviously, this is a podcast about houseplants. We're taking some liberties here, as I am allowed to do after 6 and a bit years of podcasting. Are there any indoor plants that get dragged into a murder plot? What indoor plants might we be thinking about when we're thinking about these kind of crimes?
So definitely cacti have made appearances in murder mysteries. Maybe it's because of their strange forms. Cacti and succulents, like the one behind my shoulder here, have their own kind of spooky silhouettes. But Dorothy L. Sayers, who, is one of the greats of that classic detective novel, Busman's Honeymoon, I strongly suggest you read that for the cactus-obsessed vicar, and houseplants, make several appearances. The victim had been a great collector of various cacti and succulents. So that one works really well. And then orchids appear quite often. So if there are orchid enthusiasts, on as your listeners, you have lots to choose from.
Why do you think orchids are so prevalent as a backdrop for these kind of things?
It's a good question. I think it's their unusual form is part of it. It's something that just their morphology has this kind of attractiveness, not just to their pollinators, but also to people. There was, a great craze for orchids, when they first started, being collected. Even H.G. Wells wrote a mystery of sorts. You could say, is it a mystery or is it sci-fi? But it's called Flowering of the Strange Orchid. So, that's also a really, really attractive one to me. And then lots of people have used orchids in various ways.
That brings us neatly on to Rex Stout, the author who created the character Nero Wolfe. Tell us a little bit about this character and his orchid obsession, because I think this is one that is a good starting point, again, for somebody who is into houseplants and might like to dip their toe into this kind of story.
So Nero Wolfe, the protagonist, he is an eccentric. He's also corpulent. He's reclusive. He lives in a brownstone in New York City. And so I'm going to say they're set, I think they're post-World War II. So I'm going to say 50s. Rex Stout wrote scads of them. He wrote something like 40 novels and probably as many short stories. Wolfe becomes absolutely smitten with the orchid family. He was given a Vanda orchid, very fragrant Vanda suavis, and he kills it. And then he takes it up as a challenge and buys 10 more orchids, builds a greenhouse in his 5th floor penthouse, and eventually has a collection of 10,000 orchids.
Wow.
So, he has to charge enormous fees because he's got these, very expensive hobbies, not just orchids, but he's a gastronome. So he has a chef. So there's lots of food in these mysteries. He hires, I can't remember, Theodore Horstman is Swiss, I think, orchid manager who lives in the house. He, of course, has a sidekick because Nero Wolfe doesn't go out. So he has Archie Goodwin. The novels are maybe a bit dated, they certainly do not have a feminist twist. Do not expect that, but they're still a very fun read.
I mean, this guy sounds like an absolute dude. I love the fact that he doesn't go out, but he's got this assistant who presumably goes out and does his, legwork for him. And he's got the orchid guy. I mean, he's got 10,000 orchids. I'm sure lots of listeners can relate to this scenario of getting one orchid or being given an orchid and then ending up just with this massive obsession. Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, I think we probably all wish to be in a New York brownstone with thousands of orchids and lots of assistants providing us with delicious food and tending our plants. It sounds perfect.
He gave a real address on West 35th Street. So if you walk down West 35th Street in Midtown Manhattan and look at each brownstone carefully, you will find one with a plaque that says Nero Wolfe lived here.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. And was he good at solving crime? Did he actually succeed in unraveling these mysteries?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But do not expect to get an orchid as a gift. He does not sell them, doesn't give them away. Although there is one story where he agrees to solve a murder in exchange for a couple of rare orchids.
As you would. I mean, as you would. Of course you would. Yeah, somebody offers you rare orchids to solve a crime. You're going to be in. You're going to be doing that.
So I would not only like to sort of be Nero Wolfe, I'd like to be Rex Stout because he was incredibly prolific and said, it usually takes me 6 weeks to write a book, but I try to shave a little off that. Right? You go, really? Come on. It takes me like 3 years to write a book.
Were they very popular when they came out? Were they a real hit? Were they bestsellers?
He was popular, and there have been, various TV series over time, with Nero Wolfes and Archies played by various people. My favorite was when I came across the fact that William Shatner, who I remember as Captain Kirk of the Starship Enterprise, once played Archie Goodwin.
I've got to dig that out. I'm a bit of a Trekkie. I would love to see that. That sounds great. Well, I'm definitely going to have to check out these Rex Stout books because, as I say, for some reason I'd not come across them before, but I love everything about the sound of them. So thank you for alerting me to those. More from Marta shortly, but let me take a moment to say thank you to 2 new members of my Patreon clan, Bass and Jonathan, who have both become super fans this week. So exclusive personalised cards are wending their way to their addresses, and they'll also be getting a free copy of my new audiobook of Legends of the Leaf, which is out any day now. Any day. As soon as I've got the details of that, I will put it on the podcast and on all my usual social media channels. Very exciting. And if you want to find out more about becoming a patron, you can do that by visiting the show notes at janeperrone.com, where you'll also find links to a bonus episode with Marta, where we go into more detail about Gardening is Murder, her book, including the fabulous illustrations. And if you're looking for a Christmas present for friends, family, or yourself, do check out Houseplant Gardener in a Box, my new product. It's out now. Again, more details at janeperrone.com. This set of 60 houseplant cards, all beautifully illustrated, is the perfect thing to dip in and out of over the festive season. And now, time to get back to my chat with Marta McDowell. And it's time to get on to a detective who shares my name. Miss Marple is a brilliant sleuth, and it's partly due to the fact that she also loves gardening. And she uses this to help her solve crimes too. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Also, I've always had a soft spot for Miss Marple. It's just a very appealing character. She is her own woman. Christie's, I think her first Miss Marple short story was the Tuesday Night Club which I find very interesting because there's a new series that's very popular that starts out with a title, The Thursday Murder Club.
Yes, I've
So,
just been reading the most recent book of that. I've
yeah,
just
yeah,
literally finished it this morning. So
I have been mainlining them. Just
they're so good, aren't they? They're so good. There's not enough plants in them, but they are absolutely brilliant. And that's another entry point for anyone wanting to get into those books. But yeah, anyway, so there we are. So do you think that's a reference? Do you think he's making a reference there?
it struck me immediately. I thought, wait a minute, isn't that an Agatha Christie title? And I went back and I said, no, it was the Tuesday Night Club. But I think it has to be a nod. And, if Richard Osman is listening, please make the next one something horticultural.
That one's set in a retirement village. There have to be gardeners there, right? I mean, I suppose, I don't know if you've read the most recent one. I shouldn't give too much away. Have you read the most recent one?
No, I'm holding it.
I'm not going to, no spoilers. There is a very slight... Yeah, there is a very slight horticultural angle, but it's not centre stage, but it is in there. If anyone's read the book, they'll know what I'm talking about. It does involve radishes. I'll say no more, but we definitely need a more of a gardening element to the next one, I think.
Absolutely.
Sorry, that was a tangent. Miss Marple, yeah.
The first Miss Marple came out in 1927. The last one came out in the 1970s. So, first of all, she had legs, right? She lasted. And, Christie, I think, also enjoyed writing her character, just as I think she really enjoyed writing Hercule Poirot. It really comes across. Miss Marple, I think, is that sort of quintessential village mystery, right? St. Mary Mead is this charming village. Miss Marple's home has this lovely cottage garden around it. She does not grow vegetables. She is a flower gardener, and she makes that quite clear. But I remember Agatha Christie saying, Miss Marple came out, she was 65 or 70. It's no wonder that I now really like Miss Marple. And she said I should have started her as a schoolgirl because there's no way she'd still be alive, right? Writing 4 decades of Miss Marples. And, so many actors have played Miss Marple. She tends to have a hat. She's dressed, very comfortably, but very appropriately. And little bits come out all through the Miss Marple chronicles about how she learned about gardening. Her governor taught her the language of her flowers, and she clearly knew botanical names because in one of the novels she identifies this particular species of polygonum. And she loves to garden and birdwatch because she can be outside and keep an eye on what's going on in the village.
Absolutely. That's a really key point, isn't it? That she's out in the garden, her eyes are open. People stop and talk to you when you're gardening in view of the road. I know this because, when I'm out in my front garden, people do stop. And, that's when I get questions. I have verbascums planted in my front garden. And if I'm out there doing something, my front garden is nothing to write home about, but it does have some lovely verbascums, which my husband hates because he has to park his car next to them, and they're cultivar called Snow Maiden, and you get covered in the fluff from them. But I always think, actually, if anyone committed a crime, tried to commit a crime around my house, you'd be able to identify them because they'd be covered in verbascum fluff. Anyway, but yeah, you're right. You do get to talk to people, you spot things, you see people going by. What a brilliant thing. Does she have a gardener, though? Does she employ somebody as well?
Only later on. So by the time you get to the later novels, Christie does age her. And so she does have a story where she kind of faces aging and she has to bring in Mr. Laycock, who never does things the way she would want, I really get this because, I will bring people in to help me because unfortunately my garden, I spend too much time gardening at my keyboard. So then my garden doesn't get the attention it deserves. And so I have to get help. And it's never the way you want it exactly, but you have to learn to let go. And even Miss Marple, right? She has to learn to let go. And she has gardening friends. I'm sure, all your listeners do, right? You have people that you can chat about the latest catalogs and what's growing well. And, for her, it's Dolly Bantry, who lives in the big house in town.
That's a really good point. And that's partly what gardening is about, isn't it? And I was wondering whether the other big fixture of the horticultural year in ye olde England, as we might say, is the annual show. Does that ever feature in any stories? I'm trying to remember if there's any reference to, I don't know, some dastardly crime being committed among the giant vegetables and the sweet pea display or anything like that, because that seems to me to be a plot waiting to happen, where you could have, something happening behind the scenes, some dastardly crime.
There is one. It's by Catherine Aird, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And I'm just trying to come up. A Passing Strange, I think, is the name of it. And that does have the fate, right? And they have all the tents, and there is a show, and the murder actually is in one of the tents. So that one is a lot of fun.
Going back to Miss Marple, the joy of those books also is, I think, the archetype of the English cottage garden, that we can imagine Miss Marple's garden and that we imagine it just being the absolutely perfect English cottage garden, which I know for English listeners, but also American listeners, is something that is very, is a very well thought of and loved construction. And it is a construction, obviously. Do we think she was a good gardener? I always think of myself as like you. I don't have enough time. My garden's always in a mess. But do you think her garden actually looked really good? Did she get compliments?
Oh, I think so. Because when she went to other gardens, she was, very particular. She's walking through, I'm sure you've had this feeling, where she sees some bindweed, and it's everything she can do to, prevent herself from trying, stooping down and untangling, and trying to evict the bindweed. I just assume that because she did seem to do everything well, right down to the damson gin. That's what I want to be invited for.
Yes, that's a really good point, damson gin. A good damson tree, I would say, is, unfortunately, I lost my plum tree a few years ago, and I now only have a tiny one. I don't have a damson tree, but yeah, if you're going to have plant a tree, a good damson tree for that damson gin, amazing, absolutely amazing. I have made some quince gin this autumn, so I'm going to see how that turns out. I am obviously aiming to become Miss Marple the older I get. I'm just going to be channeling this the whole way along.
You bet. You bet. So she does all sorts. She'll get the primulaveras and brew them into some. I think it was wine, cowslip wine.
Oh, okay.
So those, she has this, interest in alcoholic beverages as well, which.
Yeah. I actually have a whole little thing going on, which I call better baking through alcohol, which is basically using up all those weird bottles of alcohol that you bring back from foreign holidays in various cakes and things. And it's really interesting how you can flavour banana bread in a million different ways with those little liqueur bottles. So, yeah. Miss Marple, I think any of those Miss Marple novels are a wonderful, cosy place to go in the winter, or when you're feeling a bit down when the outside world, as it often is becoming harsh. That wonderful world of St. Mary Mead is a wonderful place to go. But have you got other recommendations for books or series or authors where people might want to start with this kind of genre with a horticultural element?
So if you want a series that has horticulture, I would look at Susan Wittig Albert. Has two different series. She's a prolific writer, and in a strange way, I've kind of followed her because she wrote a mystery series with Beatrix Potter, and then I wrote a book, Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life, and she wrote a book about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her daughter, a novel, and then I wrote a nonfiction about Laura anyway. But she has two series. One is starring an herbalist named China Bales. That is a contemporary series, so set in the undefined present, and in the Texas Hill Country, which is a beautiful part of Texas. And then she's got another series that's set in the early 1930s in Alabama, and it's about a garden club. So it's the Darlings, right? So it's Darling, Alabama. So it's the Darling Garden Club. And they are really well researched, they're well crafted, and they all have plant and gardening themes. So they're both really fun.
Fantastic. Well, I shall put links to those in the show notes for anyone who wants to follow up on that. I like the sound of both of those. And I wonder whether there's room, though, for somebody to sort of take on the sort of pandemic era houseplant surge and somehow turn that into a new character who's really into aroids, or, has a IKEA greenhouse cabinet full of Hoyas or something, and make this into kind of the 2020s equivalent of Nero Wolfe. I'm not going to be doing that, but that's an idea I'm going to throw out there for somebody to take up.
Yes, or, carnivorous plants, would be another, it's like there have been stories that include carnivorous plants, but they haven't really been the driver. It's one great fun about working on this project was also finding unusual authors who might be out of print. So there was one, I think I have it right here. Oh, this is in reprint now. It's an Irish author named Sheila Pym. Sheila Pym was a garden writer. She wrote a biography of Augustine Henry, who was a great plant collector. But this one was called Common or Garden Crime, and it's set in an Irish village during the Second World War. So that was really fun. And another one that I came across is Reginald Hill, and he wrote, I know roses, sort of off the topic of houseplants, but he wrote a brilliant book called Deadheads. Great title. Every chapter has a chapter heading of a different variety of rose, and the chapter has something to do with that, and the whole motive setting, and I guess basically all of the murder weapons are all drawn from the rose garden.
That's brilliant. Those are going straight onto my reading list. I love the sound of all of those, and I love that idea of Deadhead. What a great title. What a great title. I mean, there are so many lethal tools in the average greenhouse or shed. I know I've got some pretty lethal ones, and it's now getting to that stage where my son wants to help me in the garden, and he'll come out with some massive pruning saw and say, "Can I use this?" And you're kind of like, okay, under supervision. But I can imagine there's fruitful ground there for anyone who wants to get into this genre. And indeed, I'd love to know that somebody's writing new stuff in this area. I'm sure it's so popular, isn't it? I must hear back from you when you've read the new Thursday Murder Club book, what you thought of it, The Last Devil to Die. As I say, I've just finished it as an audiobook. And as I say, there's a little bit in there for the gardeners. So enjoy that. But thank you so much for joining me, Marta. It's been an absolute pleasure. And my reading list for the next few months is jam-packed now. So thank you very much.
And I will say, I have put the whole reading list, which is included in the book. I've also put it on my website, which is just my name. And I'm growing it. So if people have suggestions, please send them along, because what a fun resource.
I'll put a link in the show notes for that. That's excellent. Thank you so much. That's all for this week's show. I hope you've enjoyed this little diversion. And I hope that looking after your houseplants isn't murder this week. Bye! The music you heard in this episode was Roll Jordan Roll by the Joy Drops, The Road We Used to Travel When We Were Kids by Kumiko, and Plantation by Jason Shaw. All tracks are licensed under Creative Commons. Visit the show notes for details.